Hello and welcome to Talking General Practice, the podcast from GP Online. I'm Emma Bauer, the editor of GP Online. On the podcast today, I'm joined by our deputy editor Nick Bostock.
Hiya.
And senior reporter Kimberley Hackett.
Hi everyone.
To talk about some of the latest news stories affecting general practice. Coming up, we're talking about the pay rise GPs and other doctors have received this year, what GPs think about this year's contract deal and the prospect of more strikes from resident doctors. And we're looking at what's happening in Northern Ireland after the government imposed the GP contract there. We're also talking about the ongoing GP's jobs crisis after the BMA raised fears that up to 1,000 GP registrars could find themselves struggling to get a job when they complete GP training this summer, and what the union wants the government to do about this. And we're looking at some data on GP funding that shows why we're in this situation. Our good news story this week is about NHS England launching a world-first vaccine programme for gonorrhoea this summer. That's all to come on this episode of Talking General Practice. First up, let's talk about this year's pay award for doctors. The government has agreed to all of the pay increases recommended by the review body on doctors and dentists remuneration, or the DDRB. We often also call it the Doctors and Dentists Review Body. The DDRB recommended a 4% increase to GP pay for both salaried doctors and partners. Nick, what else do we know about how this will all work?
So essentially this pay rise means that the government needs to top up the GP contract package agreed for 2025-26. Back in March, the government and the BMA agreed a contract uplift worth nearly £1 billion in total for this financial year, but that package was based in part on a government assumption that GP pay would increase by 2.8%. So now that the DDRB's recommended 4% and the government's accepted that, more money needs to go in to make sure practices can pass that on to salaried GPs and to make sure partners also see their pay increase by the same amount. Because as you mentioned, the government's promised a 4% rise for both salaried GPs and partners. The way that's likely to work is through an uplift to practices' core funding, the global sum payments per patient that practices receive. But only part of the core funding overall is intended to cover staff pay. So it's that element, the so-called pay element of the GP contract, that will be topped up. As part of the negotiations around last year's GP contract, the contract for 2024-25, the government said at the time that the pay element was 44% of total global sum funding. And then at the end of last year, the BMA actually said that staff expenses were around 50% of the national practice contract funding baseline. So on that basis, we could be talking about adding an extra 1.2% to about half of the total funding practices receive from their global sum funding.
The government said that it was going to uplift the pay element of the GP contract, doesn't it? So that suggests the pay rise will work a bit like it did last year. And we know that last year's increase to the GP contract didn't provide many practices with the money they needed to fund the full increase for staff. Is that likely to happen again this year, do you think?
The problem with adding extra money to a part of the global sum payments that practices receive in this way is that there's really big variation between practices in terms of the proportion of their global sum funding that goes on staff costs. For some practices, staff costs aren't 50% of their global sum income. They can account for a far higher proportion. In some cases, I think it's more than 100%. So there'll be really big variation between practices in terms of whether a uniform uplift is enough to cover the cost of actually passing on the pay increase to employed staff or not. And that, means financial winners and losers, which is always a concern around the GP contract. Another factor is that global sum payments are only part of the total funding GP practices receive. They also receive income from enhanced services, from QOF targets and other work. And so for partners, pay comes from profit. And what that means is what's left over after all other practice costs have been covered. And if only the global sum, so only this part of their overall income stream is being uplifted, it seems fairly unlikely that partners will actually see that 4% increase that they've been promised. An accountant I spoke to said he believed that to deliver 4% for salaried GPs and partners would take around £100 million. But the concern is that if the government just tops up the pay element of the contract by an extra 1.2% on top of the 2.8% already factored in, it won't add anything like that amount to overall GP funding. Another thing it's worth mentioning is that maximum rates of pay under the ARRS, the Additional Roles Reimbursement Scheme, may now also rise in line with the 3.6% uplift agreed for NHS staff through the Agenda for Change pay scales. And in previous years, what we've seen is that maximum amounts PCNs have been able to claim per role through the ARS have risen, but the overall pot of funding available for the ARS hasn't actually changed. And that's meant that money's been stretched thinner, or practices have been sort of under pressure to top up ARS staff pay from their own income. We've already reported this year that the ARS uplift for 2025-26 didn't seem likely to be enough to cover pay increases plus the cost of increased employer national insurance costs. So that's an area of concern. That's another pressure on the funding available. And just coming back again to the issue of partner pay increases, if practices are under pressure to top up ARS pay, that again undermines partners' prospects of seeing the 4% increase they've been promised. And more generally too, if practices aren't being given the money they need to cover the headline increases that the government's actually talking about, that obviously has the potential to create all sorts of tension and pressure with staff who won't be happy if practices say that ultimately they just can't afford to pay what staff have been promised.
That was a tricky situation for many practices last year, wasn't it? They just weren't able to afford that 6% increase that the government said staff should get last year, and it did lead to quite a lot of problems for many practices, I think. So what's the BMA said about this year's pay and board? I can't imagine it's very pleased with any of this.
Yeah, the BMA view is that 4% isn't enough. They've said the funding needs to be clear to cover the points we've just discussed, to make sure there's enough funding for practices to pass on the pay rise to staff, to cover the cost of ARS pay increases. But they've said that, as things stand, practices just won't be getting enough new money from the contract this year, and that's despite this really big headline figure that's going in to create new GP roles. And that's a huge problem at a time when lots of GPs are struggling to find work, as we've often talked about. And that's why there's still communication going on between the BMA GP committee leadership and the government about changes to funding further down the track. We reported recently on a document published by the BMA. This was to make the case for more funding for general practice. It's a report called The Value of a GP, which is trying to put GP funding in the spotlight ahead of the government spending review, which is coming in the next sort of 10 days or so, potentially. And another step the BMA has raised with government is the idea of direct reimbursement at practice level for extra GP roles. So that sort of approach could be what we see down the track. That could sort of separate wider practice funding from funding for hiring GPs effectively, which could be something that's welcome.
We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but let's just carry on with some of the other stuff that's come up about the pay review. So the government has also said it will increase consultant and specialty and associate specialist or SAS doctors' pay by 4%. Resident doctors, which includes GP registrars, are to get a 4% pay rise plus a consolidated payment of £750, which the government says will give them an increase of 5.4% on average. We're going to talk about resident doctors as well in a sec. Other things worth mentioning here, the Welsh Government has also accepted the pay recommendations, and that's going to be part of the contract negotiations for this year, which are due to get underway shortly there. The government there said it's aimed to get the investment into primary care as quickly as possible. Obviously, that remains to be seen. Last year's contract negotiations in Wales dragged on throughout almost the whole financial year, so it could be a while before GPs see that pay rise there. In Scotland, the government's not yet responded to the DDRB's recommendations, but the BMA GP committee in Scotland said it was taking that with wary optimism and that the government might go over and beyond the recommendations. But again, that also remains to be seen. But the Scottish government has gone quite different ways on pay for NHS staff and doctors in recent years to what's happened in England. There's real problems going on in Northern Ireland, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. I mean, in England, Wes Streeting argued that this pay deal represents a significant investment in the NHS. In fact, we've got an opinion piece he wrote for GP Online on the website where he says exactly that. We'll put a link to that in the show notes if anyone's interested in reading exactly what he has to say. But yes, Nick, as you mentioned, the BMA isn't happy with this at all. We're going to talk about the GP jobs crisis and state of practice funding in a bit as well. And as you say, GPs are going to be quite concerned about how this uplift is applied to the contract so that they can pass on the pay rise that their staff now expect. I think it's also worth mentioning some results from our recent survey of GPs and practice managers here about this year's contract. We've talked about the contract deal a lot on the podcast since it was announced, but the general feeling, is that this year's deal's better than it has been in previous years, but it doesn't go far enough for what general practice actually needs. And I think those findings kind of came through in our survey as well. Only 1 in 9 GPs and practice managers said they thought that this year's contract was a good deal for general practice, with most saying the uplift would not cancel out the impact of increased employer national insurance contributions. A lot of responses from GP partners in particular saying that their take-home pay has barely shifted over the past decade or so. Also, a lot of comments, that if the government is really serious about transforming the NHS, placing a much bigger focus on prevention, then it really needs to allocate serious funding to general practice, and that's just not what practices have at the minute. We've touched on resident doctors. So in England, they are balloting again on industrial action at the minute, aren't they? What's going on with that?
Resident doctors obviously went on strike last year over pay, and that whole wave of action came to an end when they agreed a deal over the summer that promised a pay increase of around 22% over 2023-24 and 24-25 combined. But the strikes ultimately were put on hold on the basis that the government would work with resident doctors in future to sort of correct the erosion of pay that's happened over the past decade and a half. Ultimately, they've said that the pay uplift on offer this year isn't enough to do that. Resident doctors, including GP registrars, have been told they're going to see not just the 4% basic uplift we've been talking about for doctors, but also a £750 top-up that will take their rise to about 5.4% on average. But the BMA says resident doctor pay has dropped by nearly a quarter in real terms since 2008. Basically, its argument is that the uplift for this year does nothing to reverse that. So ballot papers started going out last week, and the ballot's going to be open until the 7th of July, and fairly soon after that we'll find out whether more NHS strikes are on the cards, and then basically the ball is going to be in the government's court in terms of whether it decides to stick to its guns or, potentially offer more to try and avoid strike action.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the results are actually, whether there's still the same strength of feeling as there was a couple of years ago really about this, and what the turnout will be like. It's going to be interesting to see whether the BMA can mobilise doctors in the same sort of way they were able to do.
I feel like the majority are going to come down in favour, because I think enough of them will remember the arguments in previous years, and I think this whole argument that no doctor now is worth less than they were 15 years ago, that carries a lot of weight ultimately, and that I would imagine we'll get a vote in favour. But then whether it actually comes to the strike action is another thing, because obviously there's some negotiating water to pass under the bridge between now and then or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. There was one other thing that we should highlight about all of this as well, and that was another recommendation from the DDRB, which in fact none of the UK governments have yet to agree. So in its final report, the DDRB said that the 4 UK governments should work with the BMA to develop an index of general practice costs, which it said should be used in future to determine the uplifts that should be applied to the expenses element of the GP contract. The DDRB report basically said that any uplifts to contracts each year need to give practices enough money to implement the body's pay recommendations in full, including giving GP partners the recommended pay rise. And as we've talked about already, Nick, as you've mentioned, this just hasn't happened for lots of practices in previous years. And the DDRB actually acknowledged that in this year's report. So the review body says there needs to be some sort of mechanism to ensure that increased costs do not cause problems for practices and undermine delivery of primary care. And it specifically actually highlighted the recent rise in employers' national insurance contributions as an example of one of those increases in costs that needs to be accounted for in contract uplifts. So this index of general practice costs would then be used to make sure that any increases in cost practices face are properly covered by the contract uplift. What is interesting about this is the DDRB says that basically standard levels of inflation are not likely to necessarily correlate with the increase in cost practices experience, and the DDRB said that this cost index should be something that's basically sorted out as part of GP contract negotiations in each of the 4 countries. Anyway, as I say, the governments have not committed to this yet. In a statement to Parliament, Wes Streeting backed the DDRB's advice on pay, but said the government needed further time to consider the other non-paid recommendations, which include this one. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. And I can imagine it's something that BMA will definitely be following up on in discussions with the government now, and it could be something that becomes perhaps part of the new GP contract further down the line.
So, Emma, you also wrote recently about what's going on in Northern Ireland, and we mentioned that briefly earlier. So what's the deal with the GP contract there?
Yeah, it's a pretty bad picture in Northern Ireland at the minute. So on the last news podcast, we mentioned a referendum that the BMA in Northern Ireland had carried out on the contract deal that was on the table for 2025-26, so this financial year. And the results of that showed that the profession had overwhelmingly rejected it. 99.6% of GPs who voted rejected that deal, and that was on a turnout of 65%. So the BMA had been pushing for an £80 million uplift to core funding to stabilise general practice. That's what it said it needed to make sure that general practice was on a sound footing. They also wanted a fully funded indemnity solution for all GPs in Northern Ireland and funding to cover the employer's national insurance increase. That £80 million is basically 1% of the overall health budget in Northern Ireland. And general practice in Northern Ireland actually currently gets the lowest proportion of NHS funding in any of the four nations. It gets just 5.4% of the total funding, which is a tiny amount. What the government had put forward in the deal in the end, and what the profession resoundingly rejected, was only a £1 million uplift to core funding, which was also going to be tied to improvements around access. Also £5 million to cover the cost of indemnity, which the BMA said would only cover GP partners, so they didn't feel that was sufficient, and £3.5 million to cover the national insurance costs, which the BMA also said wouldn't cover the actual costs involved. So basically £9.5 million in all. The BMA said that was a paltry offer. That was the word it used. After the referendum, the BMA called on the government to come back to the negotiating table, come up with a better deal, and that got pretty short shrift, basically, from the Health Minister. Just a few days after that referendum result was published, Health Minister Mike Nesbitt imposed the contract on the profession. He made a statement in the Northern Ireland Assembly basically saying there's no more money, this is all the government could offer, and it was a best and final offer, so there's no point having any more discussions because it would just give GPs false hope that more money could be forthcoming. He said the cupboard's bare. The health department in Northern Ireland currently actually has a deficit of £600 million, so it's massively in trouble. In that statement, interesting enough, Mike Nesbitt said the DDR pay recommendations would be looked at separately to the contract deal, which suggested more money could be forthcoming. And indeed, the government in Northern Ireland, well, the health department in Northern Ireland, Mike Nesbitt, did go on to accept the recommendations on pay for NHS staff and for doctors. But when he announced that, he said it was inevitable. He would be told by the department he could not afford it. But basically he said, we're going to pay this, and now it'll be up to the Northern Ireland executive to find that money, or it'll be up to them to refuse to do it, and that will potentially cause problems. And because of all that, it's completely unclear when that pay rise is likely to come through to staff in Northern Ireland.
What does this mean? I mean, what happens next with general practice in Northern Ireland around all this?
Well, I think relations between the BMA and the Health Minister seem like they're quite strained after that statement Mike Nesbitt made in the Assembly. And obviously the results of the BMA referendum. BMA Northern Ireland GP Committee Chair Dr Francis O'Kagan described the Minister as being very dismissive of GPs' concerns. The Health Minister himself in that statement to the Assembly was really quite critical of the BMA, describing its demands as unrealistic. So basically it looks like we're heading towards collective action in Northern Ireland. In that referendum on the contract deal, 89% of GPs who voted said they were prepared to take collective action. And last Friday, the Northern Ireland BMA GP Committee wrote to members and said it was working on developing a suite of collective action steps which would be assessed and evaluated by the legal team. Basically, like recent collective action in England, the BMA wants to ensure that any steps practices take will not put them in breach of their contract or any other regulations. So things they can legitimately do under the terms of how they operate in the NHS. The BMA is then going to outline these measures to members, and GP partner BMA members will then be able to vote in a referendum on collective action, where they'll be able to vote on each of the measures the BMA is proposing as well. But the results from that first referendum suggest it's very likely GPs will back collective action. What that action ends up looking like remains to be seen, but I expect it'll probably be things that are very similar to what happened in England recently. And I would imagine the BMA safe working guidance will form a key part of the measures the BMA are encouraging practices to take, because that was obviously the key plank of what went on in England.
And that's obviously this guidance that applies, not just in England, but universally across the UK.
Absolutely. And it's been something all of the GP committees, all 4 GP committees, have really been pushing to members in all 4 countries that they should adopt that way of working in their practice. So I expect we'll see a big ramping up of that in Northern Ireland as well. So we've talked quite a lot about general practice funding today, and one of the biggest signals of how acute the underfunding crisis has become is the GP jobs crisis, which we've talked about at length on the podcast. Kimberley, over the past couple of weeks, something we've not spoken about yet, the BMA has written to Wes Streeting warning that the jobs crisis is set to get worse. What have they actually said?
Yeah, so in the warning letter to Wes Streeting, the BMA said that, come August, when many GP registrars complete their training, there could be up to 1,000 newly qualified GPs unable to find work, which means that the unemployment rate will significantly increase for GPs.
This will be the second year, won't it, since they really started ramping up GP training places. And we had a similar situation last summer, didn't we, just as the election was happening, about concerns about GP registrars. We've talked about GPs being added to the Additional Roles Reimbursement Scheme, or the ARRS, which this government introduced shortly after it was elected, actually as an emergency measure to address those problems last summer. That's been expanded again this year, Kimberley, but the BMA doesn't think that's the answer to the problems, does it? What did they say about that?
So the BMA did say in the letter that they understand that the ARRS now includes GPs and more funding has been added to the pot for the 2025-26 contract. But the union doesn't believe that these changes will create more jobs for the August cohort of newly qualified GPs, because PCNs are likely to have already spent most of their ARRS staff budgets.
And that's always been a big concern about those changes to the contract, hasn't it? I think we've talked about them before. I mean, the BMA has some pretty clear ideas, though, on what needs to be done to solve the problem, doesn't it? They want money to go directly to practices. What have they actually asked Streeting to do?
So the union wants Wes Streeting to allocate ring-fence funding directly to general practice to hire newly qualified and under or unemployed GPs, because, we know it isn't only newly qualified GPs who are struggling to find work. And they want this funding to be separate from the ARRS pot of money to ensure that newly qualified GPs work at one practice. Currently, GPs hired under the ARRS scheme who have to have qualified within the past 2 years can be expected to work across multiple sites. And this actually goes against the BMA guideline that ARRS GPs shouldn't work across more than 2 practices. And as you said earlier on, Emma, the expansion of the ARRS scheme to include GPs was only supposed to be an emergency measure because so many GPs were struggling to find work last year. But, the initial low salary and possibility of working across many sites has meant that the BMA has been quite critical of the role. In fact, I recently spoke to a GP who took on an ARRS role after having applied for more than 100 jobs, but they actually ended up leaving after only 6 months. The GP who completed their training in September 24 and took on the job in October told me they were working from a hub and were actually the most senior person on site with very little support. They would see up to 30 patients a day that were fed into the hub from multiple practices across the PCN, but there was no continuity of care. They couldn't follow up on test results because all of these would go back into the patient's practice. So in the end, the GP decided that they had to leave because they weren't managing chronic diseases or building relationships with patients. They even said that they felt like they were losing skills. But they have now moved to another ARRS role where they are happier because they are based in one practice and do now offer continuity of care, which is in line with the BMA's suggestion.
That particular job that the GP left after 6 months seemed to sort of represent everything that GPs said they were worried about, the kind of ARS jobs that GPs most felt were inappropriate. That seemed to be it. What's really interesting as well is that this GP, perhaps partly because of a lack of other options, is again in an ARS job, but that ARS job is much more suitable and is much more in line with the kind of thing that GPs would like to see those jobs look like. So it shows that the ARS can create jobs that are perhaps suitable for those sorts of GPs coming into the workforce. This is also just like a really strong demonstration of the fears that GPs had about the kind of ARS jobs that might emerge were absolutely justified.
And it's so varied across the country.
Nick, something else that you've been doing some analysis of some new data that's been published on GP funding, and you wrote a story last week that really lays bare why we're in this situation. What did you find when you looked at that data?
There's a set of stats that normally come out annually showing the sort of total NHS payments made to GP practices in each financial year. And this particular set was delayed by about 6 months, probably to do with the change of government and so on. We've just now got hold of the data on payments to general practice for the 2023-24 financial year. But what those figures show is that GP funding per patient rose by less than 3% compared with the previous year. And that's way short of the near 10% increase to the minimum wage in that year, for example. And it's, short of inflation at the time. An accountant I spoke to said that basically this shows exactly why general practice is in the situation it's currently in, with thousands of GPs unable to find work, practices unable to afford to recruit. Funding just hasn't kept up with costs, and these figures confirm it.
Yeah, I mentioned our survey earlier, like one of the questions we looked at earlier, but we also asked GPs and practice managers in that survey about their priorities for a new GP contract. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given the situation we're currently in and what we've been talking about today, one of the top priorities for GPs was a contract that baked in guaranteed funding uplifts that match inflation, or maybe match that new cost index that might come along. But they really wanted funding uplifts that matched inflation, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right. So having a mechanism to uplift funding in line with inflation each year, or ideally faster than inflation, I would imagine, was the number one thing that GPs identified in our survey as a sort of change they wanted to see. It was about 4 in 5 people who took part in the survey picked that out as a priority for contract reform. And I think ultimately that reflects both the erosion of funding over the past 10 years or more, and maybe specifically over the course of the 5-year contract that ran from 2019 to 2024. That contract had fixed uplifts each year baked into it, and they were baked in at the start. It was agreed at a time of very low inflation. But then when it came to the final years of that 5-year contract, the fixed uplifts were way short of inflation, short of the minimum wage rises that were agreed in those years. So practices were losing out each year in real terms. And like we just mentioned, that's very much at the root of the problem with GP unemployment. There were some other priorities too for safeguarding practice funding that came through from that survey. Around 2/3 of GPs said they wanted a list of core services that they were paid a fixed amount per patient to provide. A similar proportion wanted direct reimbursement for premises costs as well. And there was also a lot of support for capping patient lists at a safe level for direct reimbursement of all practice staff costs. And that comes back to what we discussed earlier around the problems with the way money for this year's GP pay rise is being delivered, as well as steps like going back to an item of service funding model for general practice. That's something that hasn't been part of the funding system for more than 20 years now. We've talked a lot about the fact that as things stand, practices receive a fixed payment per patient for unlimited work. This is, the idea of this all-you-can-eat buffet in general practice. And so tackling that's a big issue, particularly at the time when, workload's really heavy for GPs.
We'll have to wait and see over the coming weeks whether or not, Wes Streeting's likely to move on that thing that Kimberley was talking about, whether there is likely to be any money forthcoming. The prospect of hundreds of GPs maybe being without a job at the end of the summer, that's not going to look good for the government. So when they did come through with some kind of emergency measure last year, so it'll be interesting to see whether they feel like they've got the headroom to take any emergency steps this year. But maybe all they'll do is expand the ARRS rather than money direct to practices. But we'll have to wait and see. And obviously these bigger issues with the contract, that's a longer term discussion that will be rumbling on for the next year, 2 years, and I'm sure we'll be writing about all these things a lot as time goes on. Before we go, we've just got time for our good news slot, and this week it's about a new vaccination programme that will launch in England in August for gonorrhoea. NHS England has said this is a world-first vaccination programme which will target those most at risk of the infection. Those eligible will include gay and bisexual men who have a recent history of multiple sexual partners or an STI, and the jab will be offered through sexual health services. The programme will use the existing meningococcal B vaccine and comes after a recommendation from the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisation. The JCVI said real-world studies have estimated that the vaccine has between a 32.7 and 42% effectiveness against gonorrhoea. Analysis has suggested the vaccine could prevent up to 100,000 cases of the infection over the next 10 years if high uptake is achieved. NHS England said that sexual health services will identify and contact eligible patients who will be also offered the Mpox, hepatitis A and B and HPV jabs when they attend for their appointments. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks to Nick and Kimberley. I'll be back next week when I'm speaking to Dr. Caroline Taylor, who's a GP and chair of the National Association of Primary Care, about creating a neighbourhood NHS and where general practice should fit within this. So please do join me then. In the meantime, don't forget you can keep up to date with all the latest news affecting general practice and access lots of other resources and information on our website at GPonline.com.